The world tells everyone to shut up. That statement hit me like a face full of cold water. Sudden, startling bracing, a wake-up call, even within my therapy. And almost like a Zen wake-up call. Within weeks, I completed a long course of therapy. But I'm not going to talk about my therapy today. What I want to share is more the waking, the feeling of waking in that awareness. The world tells everyone to shut up. It could be dismissive. It could be flippant. But that statement can also be a spiritual perspective on our very human being. And that is the existential path I want to take you down this morning. We come into the world needy, demanding, in short, infants or infantile. Somehow, out of that, nature has equipped us to grow from utter dependency to relative independence. Psychologists call it autonomy, to be a self-directed center of agency, a mature ego. Perhaps most of us mostly are, most of the time, but the Enlightenment world picture of autonomous individuals linked through a series of rational voluntary contracts is, to say the least, a misrepresentation. Each of us still carries within her at least traces of our premature selves, all born early enough to perhaps get through the birth canal, far from ready to be selves at all. Out of that blooming, buzzing confusion, as the philosopher William James puts it, life calls us to somehow become the unique individuals that each of us will be. And most of that work was done, during ages that our memory can no longer reach back to. How much will my 4-year-old granddaughter remember of these days with her pop-pop? But my God, how she has already matured. What an individual she has already become. The catch, at least the one I'm speaking to today, is this. As we become our unique selves, we also need to belong. And we don't always feel accepted for who we are. I'd guess most of you can recall a time pretty early in life when you felt less than welcome in your world. But when did that start? What might have happened? How many times and in how many ways in those days now lost beyond recall? Those days that so shaped who we now suppose ourselves to be. Okay, maybe my title line isn't literally true. Not verifiably anyway, but think for a moment about the we beings that our emerging selves once were. How reliant and how trusting we must once have been. And how little might it take to shake that well-born faith, that trust. How many ways could that world have cast doubt on me, over me, into me? Because at that age, perhaps a wedge between me and the world lives on as a wedge within me. Ta-Nehisi Coates takes for his memoir the title Between Me and the World. A black in a racially underclassed precinct of white America would have plenty to remember of being othered, wouldn't he? Many recall when their sexual preference or gender identity stirred under cover or under threat. Or maybe they were just a tomboy and never quite fit in. How many artists were first welcomed for their art? Or, like a good friend of mine, might have been stigmatized just for being a smart kid who liked school. I don't want to equate our personal challenges or affronts or assaults amongst ourselves or with more celebrated cases. Rather, my point is, doesn't it make sense to suppose that each of us bears some history of rebuff, of deep or at least deeply felt rebuff, of rejection, of ridicule, of abandonment, often of shame? Shame, deeper than guilt because it goes deeper than anything I may have done to who I am. Maybe your world didn't tell you to shut up. Maybe it said, "Speak up, you introvert." Maybe it was something else. But it would be more surprising, to me at least, if your emerging ego had sailed through unscathed, wouldn't it? And why suppose that you'd now remember the things that a person would most want to forget, especially earliest in life? And the younger you were, the less equipped you were to fend off those psychic blows. So put those observations together, and it's at least plausible that every one of us has been through something like that, and that it's not just history. I'll share only one thing about me that helps explain why my title line hit me like it did. For almost all my life, my self-narrative has included this fortuitous bent. I had a lot of love poured into my foundations, so my sense of self-acceptance runs really deep. That is true, and blessedly so. But living years in that confidence while struggling through my real life, it never occurred to me that there was another shoe to drop. It hit me in the bathroom in the middle of a therapy session. Wait a minute. The more secure I felt, the harder it would hit me if that security gave way. Right? How many decades did I not even think of that? So, in mucking through my life and trying to get some therapy to help me get some perspective, that kind of set in motion the sequence that led to my title, Insight. So if you're willing, I'd like to suggest that the whole perspective of my being in the world, who I am, who I've been, where I'm going, what I'm capable of, in a sense, my human selfhood, is not the thing I might have thought I knew. Not because it's something else, because perhaps the existential philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre is right that our self is not a thing at all. That the process of becoming who we are is nothing but process. The becoming is nothing but the ongoing today only, tomorrow we'll see. Not because we lack habits or consistency or continuity or the many values and confidences and doubts that bring a consistency to the characters we recognize ourselves by. Not because of that, but because none of that is a given, and none of what I think I am is inalterably fixed. So if I go back to the tension from which I opened, that each of us is becoming our true self, it's not a truth we are needing to recover from a lost Eden. It is not a truth that is promised to us in a form that will be realized in an envisioned specific heaven. Life, human being, is the very process of answering the question in the questioning way that the question demands. I'm sounding pretty existential today, aren't I? But to me, this just makes sense. If I look at the world not from an enlightenment point of view, well, you've got these egos and they're rational and they do these things. If I start from the mess that I arose from and the very uncertain meanderings that have followed from that, it just makes sense for me to look at the world this way. When I do that, try, if you're willing, to follow me into this perspective. The world tells everyone to shut up. Let me take a swallow of life. My first finding on that path is perhaps the soul of our many UU sources, compassion. Once I find deeply in myself a vulnerability still present, especially when I can feel that presence as more than just my quote-unquote past. Once I see that everyone carries their own personalized, unfulfilled cross, if you will, doesn't that view show us in all our shared humanity? Isn't it even natural then to feel for everyone's private, perhaps unknowable vulnerability, discomfort? The parts they'd be least inclined to share openly. And what of the manifold ways we adapt to that? It's not just our inner child, vulnerable kind of more innocent, potentially harmed self that we could feel compassion for. But what about the manifold ways we adapt to that situation? How differently we bluster or clam up or cry for help or put our shoulder into it. Can you see how I might be more understanding of the flawed and frustrating ways my fellows cope their way forward in our world? Of course. So the first upshot of my existential perspective is compassion. But if my first finding is compassion, even for all, I too am one of those human beings. Am I not? Do you know people who can forgive anyone but themselves? I know some people like that. Don't be one. Self-compassion is almost the opposite of self-indulgence. To have compassion toward ourselves is to nurture and strengthen us for whatever work we may have in mind or in our hearts. It magnifies any gift we might give. Think of it this way, too. For so many of us, the most critical voice is the one we ourselves give lodging to in our brains. But psychologists from Freud forward have detailed the ways we introject those voices. Maybe the expectations I find myself failing are not my expectations at all. If that's so, then one very promising avenue for growth is to gather some distance from the most impelling commandments I hear. To take a reflective step back through philosophy, through personal contemplation, through meditation, through mindfulness, to reflect, to explore, or simply to breathe. My third point is not a new finding, but a finding of new emphasis, if you will, that growth is dynamic. It's not that we just grow up to be something or someone. Not at all. Listen, some of us are old enough to say, I hear that, Brother Mark. Let me play off an example. There was a Twilight Zone once about a 2-bit gambler who sold his soul to the devil. And then he won every game. Every single game he gambled, he won. He had money coming out his ears. Now he had a whole lot of friends. Now all the women were throwing themselves at him, right? The guy's rich, he can't lose. It didn't play as well as he'd hoped. He kind of got bored with it. Can you imagine that? He's Goes back to the devil. He says, heaven is not what I thought it was going to be. And the devil says, ha, 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 ha. You think you're in heaven? That ain't heaven. I gotcha. The reason I bring that in here is that if we look at the between me and the world as the me is who I really am, and then there's that bad world out there, which is sort of the way Rousseau thought about it in terms of the role of society, as opposed to our natural, intrinsically good, innocent, caring selves. If I think of it that way, then what I'm thinking is my real self is so withheld from the world that it's not real at all. It's a fantasy. And so if I fantasize that the world could be just like I want it to be, if I fantasize that the world would not challenge me, if I fantasize, I'm putting myself into the hell of that gambler. Okay, you've got everything you ever wanted. You're a perfected version of who you used to be or what you used to want. No more growth, no more challenge, no more stimulation from there. One of the ways that Sartre puts this, again, that existential mid-20th century philosopher that so many of us have at least heard of, he says, you are your life and nothing more. So if I say, no, I know I haven't done that, but really, no. You are your life. When you die, that's who you are. There's no more of it. Until you die, that picture is continually subject to change, like a work of progressive art. Sartre also said in the play No Exit, hell is other people. Meaning in part that we don't like the fact that other people see us without being inside of us, without being on our side. They see us from where they are. The look of the other challenges, and for Sartre, it's like an ontological affront. It's like at the very level of existential being. It's like the very existence of other people prevents me from being secure in myself because there are others. I can never just be myself. They see me. Well, some, including myself, think Sartre had some neuroses in him, reflected on that. But where I'm going with this is that if we can see the other people in our world, not just as the eyes that look into us, but as people who are also squirming under the eye of the other, people who are also carrying their own burdens, their own shift, then we can use that world of others as a crucible within which we grow our better selves. From that perspective, actually, I want to give you a little piece of psychological data here. In summary form, there's a curve on stress. If you have too much stress going on in your experience of your world, your ability to function declines. That makes sense, right? We've all experienced it. But if you don't have enough stress, if like that gambler you never lose, if there's nothing to challenge you, you also are very low on that performance or efficiency or whatever curve you want to call it. So in that spirit, what I'm suggesting, if myself is never finished, if I'm looking for the right kinds of challenges, then what I want to do, I want to develop myself. I want to grow myself to be someone that can venture into the world with some risk, venture into the world of other people, and at the same time, look for a link between what is most human in me and what is most human in the people who really are my world. My world is not an enlightenment concept. My world is the people that are out there that I interact with. if by taking the perspective I'm sharing this morning, I can listen for the voices that are most reluctant and sometimes most flawedly the finest, if I can listen for that stranger within the other that doesn't want to come out, if I can appreciate that even the person that tells me to shut up has something going on besides bossy, the more I can attune the rhythms of my expectations of the world to those things, I believe the better I will be able to use the voice that I have instead of cowering, instead of padding it in 16 layers of, well, potentially, and instead of dampening the effectiveness that might be there. So my final link, my final takeaway from this is that the link that was broken or bent or never resolved in the bridge I was trying to build to the world, the fantasy self of hell is other people, the fantasy villains that holds up to a mirror, no. The vulnerability that I've been speaking to belongs to the most real of who we are. The sheltered, stuttering, tentative, hoping, feeling part of us. What is least reducible to the lowest common denominator. Our individual. If I can sense in myself and in others, not know, but something more than just infer, if I can sense in myself the real you that only you are, then the real world that I need to be moving and having my being in that world becomes not this image of the lowest common denominator that becomes something we all need to conform to. It becomes a confluence of artistic possibilities that we're all living through. It becomes something that a Buddhist could appreciate, something that a Sufi could appreciate, so we could go through any of our sources, humanists and otherwise, something that is deeply spiritual, but in a spirit that does not rely on any creed of otherworldliness and is equally existential. Because the real irreplaceable you, the real irreplaceable me, the humanity of our humanness, is this paradox that each one of us is a minority of one. But we are alike in that. So 100% of human beings are a minority of one, to put it statistically. We are all in the same boat. Our common humanity is not some lowest common denominator, but what is most human in each of us. We are beings who are consciously aware of being individual beings. As such, we're all in it together. We're all in the same boat. And it's that boat I begin to sail when I get farther down the path that we've been going this morning. Thank you.